Welcome back to Profiteers versus the People. So ordinarily, this is a show where we fact-check the heroic stories that the famously wealthy dictate on their own or pay PR firms to spin on their behalf. We comb through the resources we're able to find and put our subjects on crutches, which is our PR torture test acronym. The C stands for consumer harm, the R stands for rich parents, the U stands for union suppression and employee abuse, the T stands for tax evasion and taxpayer dependence, the second C stands for child labor and child harm, the H stands for harassment allegations, the E stands for egregious behavior after hours, and the S stands for slap suits and journalist suppression. Money Mike is out of town, which means it is just going to be you and it is just going to be me. And the series that we've waded into on Nestle is pretty dark. So I thought I would share a story, kind of break things up, that I find myself laughing about a great deal when I'm driving somewhere or in the shower or wherever. The story begins with a black man in jail in the early 1900s and ends with that same man getting rich by humiliating American whites on a global scale. I'm RadBill, there's no money here, and... Though Jack Johnson's story had been going for 23 years before our tale began and would carry on for 31 years after it ended, we're going to cue the music in February of 1901. A young Jack Johnson is scraped off the ring in his hometown of Galveston, Texas, and thrown into jail with the man who knocked him out, Joe Choinsky. Joe Choinsky was a well-known Jewish heavyweight boxer. The fight was sanctioned, but prize matches weren't legal in the state, so both men were sent to the brink. Bail for such a discretion was set at the modern equivalent of $200,000 in the moral haven of Texas. And because neither of the two athletes could afford such a sum, $5,000, they were trapped and became the one thing worse than a prisoner in that day and age. An entertainer in that day and age. In exchange for the right to return home each night, the two men fought for an audience of guards, which quickly grew to include a large number of civilians. To the guards, this was cheap entertainment, but to Jack Johnson, an already somewhat promising boxer, sparring and training with Choinsky, who recognized his abilities and determination, was a turning point. Upon his release, Johnson got the hell out of Texas and headed for Denver, Colorado, where he stayed briefly before heading to Bakersfield, California. And before long, wins began piling up. 27 wins in the ring by 1902, and then Johnson propositioned the heavyweight champion, a white American named Jim Jeffries. When Jeffries refused, on the basis that Johnson was black, Johnson decided it was time to make a statement, and in May of 1902, he went up against a Jeffries who would get in the ring with him. Jim's much less famous brother, Jack Jeffries. After 5 rounds of patronizing the younger Jeffries, Jack Johnson knocked him out cold. He then helped hoist his unconscious opponent to his respective corner of the ring, and standing over his unconscious sibling, Jack promised Jim to his face that he could whip him too. It is here that white audiences got the first hint that Jack Johnson was not only a tremendous athlete, but a man who could meet them where they lived. When the situation called for it, Jack Johnson could resolve things with violence. When that wasn't an option, he was just as effective as any white opponent at being cruel. So, following the vein of cruelty being necessary, in February of 1903, Jack Johnson defeated the best black heavyweight of the day, claiming the unofficial title reserved for such a summit, and then beat the other 3 top black heavyweights of the day just for the sake of being thorough. There was no denying it at this point for Jim Jeffries. It was time for the heavyweight champ to shit or get off the pot. Evidently aware of this, Jeffries announced his retirement and that he would serve as the referee for the fight that would determine his successor, among 2 white fighters, as it just so happened. The match happened on July 3rd, 1905, between Jack Root and Marvin Hart. And after 12 rounds, Jeffries declared Hart the rightful heir to his throne. Following the fight, Hart vowed to defend his newfound title, saying he would meet any man in the world in a fair fight. This challenge does not apply to colored people, he added at the very end. Here, Johnson was in a bind. Marvin Hart had no younger siblings Johnson could humiliate in the ring to try and coax Marvin into a fight himself, so he had to lay in wait. But not for long. Just 7 months later, the title would go to a Canadian fighter under the name Tommy Burns. After claiming the title, Burns, whose real name was Noah Brusso, exclaimed to the world that he was different from his US-based opponents. He intended to be the champion of the world, not just the champion of Canada or North America, and would defend his title against any and all challengers. He was open to fighting black, Mexican, Indian, or any other nationality. He was undoubtedly applauded for this position. He's applauded still by several of our sources who seem to position him as a more modern and accepting man, but in reality, this was an open invitation more formally than substantively. I like making this distinction where possible, and I want to thank Abigail Thorne, she doesn't know she's my Jedi Master, but she's my Jedi Master for teaching me the difference between these two things and a lot more. But formal access is the access that's written into law, so to speak. Formally, any citizen of the United States has access and can run for office, and any man in 1906 could challenge Tommy Burns to a fight. Substantive access is the more logistical definition of access. Substantively, you need to have big financial coffers to run for office in the U.S. unless you're AOC, seemingly. And in 1906, you needed to have some considerable clout to fight Tommy Burns, and you'd have to get in line behind all the white challengers because Tommy wanted to give them a shot first. And you would need financial backing because although Burns had announced willingness to fight anyone and everyone, to fight a black challenger, he quietly insisted that the pot be, at minimum, $30,000, which was an unheard of amount at that time. Burns had opened the door to the elements, shouted, "You want some of this? I'm right here!" and then shut and locked the door. It is here that once again Jack found himself held back by someone who is very likely afraid of him and his capacity for sportsmanlike violence. Thus, to break through and reach the summit of boxing greatness, he once again had to rely on his penchant for cruelty. Fortunately for Jack, he now shared one more commonality with Burns and other successful whites, though to a lesser but still meaningful degree. Johnson now had the resources to put on a traveling show for Tommy Burns, a white supremacist who supposedly believed black fighters had weaker stomachs, less endurance, and smaller brains. As the newly anointed heavyweight champion traveled the world defending his title against white fighters in England, France, and Australia, Jack Johnson followed, launching a campaign to be the caveat to Tommy's title in every sense. In the press, at the bank, cashing prize checks, and in the ring standing over unconscious white fighters all over Europe, there was Jack Johnson, there to taunt Burns into agreeing to a fight. An Australian financier, apparently infatuated by the earning potential of a race war, which many believed would result from a fight between a black fighter and a white fighter for the heavyweight title, put up the $30,000 prize, and Burns finally relented, agreeing to fight Johnson, his greatest challenger, in Sydney, Australia, on December 26, 1908, to enormous fanfare. Johnson reluctantly agreed to accepting a $5,000 payout for the fight, still a reasonable sum, but nowhere obviously near the $30,000 that Tommy Burns would be taking home. And it was put in the books. Christmas is coming late this year, thought thousands of white boxing fans across the world. Their beliefs aligned pretty closely to those of Tommy Burns, and as such, odds favored Burns heavily against his supposedly weak-stomached, smaller-brained opponent. As the fight approached, heinous press coverage seemed to endorse these sentiments. The natural supremacy of the white man meant Tommy Burns' victory was all but guaranteed. White attendees arrived at the ring as early as 6 a.m. for the 11 a.m. fight. They welcomed Johnson, who was dressed modestly, to the stadium with boos and racial slurs. He flashed his gold-toothed smile once reaching the arena, undoubtedly angering the audience further. I've been talking about Johnson's penchant for cruelty, but his comfort with this must be connected to the fact that none of these people in the audience would dare confront him outside the ring. Anyways, then it was time for a bigot to confront Jack inside the ring. Tommy Burns entered the ring in a fine blue suit, which he tucked away neatly into a suitcase when the time came. Johnson attempted a handshake, but was left hanging by his opponent, that is, Tommy Burns. Observers were extremely careful to look for any perceived advantages in Johnson's equipment and attire, delaying the fight's commencement by almost 10 minutes to check how Johnson's bandages were wrapped. Nothing was going to keep the white man from proving his dominance on this, the day after White Jesus' birthday. The first bell tap sounded, and before reverberations had left the fixture's radius, Burns was down and struggling back to his feet. He had immediately charged his opponent and was driven to the ground by an incredible uppercut by Johnson. It took him 8 seconds to stand back up. Now, this was not a knockout punch, I would theorize, because Jack Johnson didn't want it to be a knockout punch. And indeed, Johnson would state after the fight he wanted this to last a while, and he wanted it to hurt. For the next 13 rounds, Burns showered Johnson with racial slurs as Johnson followed the rules to the letter and made Burns shower the entire contest in blood. To racist onlookers, the fight surely resembled a sanctioned mugging. As the match carried on, the canvas of the ring, Burns' face, and the full radius of each of Johnson's gloves would be painted in deep red Aryan purity. By round 13, one of Burns' eyes had swollen shut, and his mouth was bleeding so profusely his shoulders were completely covered in blood. Police entered the ring to halt the onslaught, but in response to Burns' adamant protests, they allowed the fight to carry on. "I've got him sweating real bad," Burns might have thought. "It's only a matter of time before his lesser endurance fails him and he tires out." But unfortunately for Burns, Johnson didn't tire out, and when it became evident in the next round that Burns was now completely unable to defend himself, the police once again entered the ring and removed the pathetic remains of the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world. An audience of 20,000 white onlookers, many on the literal losing end of a bet in favor of white supremacy, now sat in eerie silence. Whether they liked it or not, the whole white world had to welcome a new king that day in Australia, and for the first time in history, he was black. Commentary on this moment took a shape that was at once surprising and deeply unsurprising. Where to many onlookers before the fight began, victory was all but guaranteed for Burns, the Sydney Morning Herald, after the fight, wrote of it as a tragedy. Quote, "That brave little man suffering untold pain and battling against what he must have known from the first round were impossible odds. The most nefarious stories on the match bemoaned the lack of progress Jack's performance represented for the black race, and the most surprising perspective came from Jack London. That's Jack Johnson, the author of the haunting short story To Build a Fire, of whose racism I only learned while researching for this episode. He surprised many when he dissented from the most consistent narrative, effectively admitting that he felt Jack Johnson was nothing if not the superior athlete. "All hail to Johnson," he wrote. "His victory was unqualified." That being said, London did agree with the masses on one thing. The story wasn't over. There was no denying Jack Johnson his victory in the fight against Burns, but there was no allowing him to carry on as the heavyweight champion. The white race in its entirety was at a low point in this moment, and the only thing that could save them was a true example of white athletic excellence, which Jack London and others would come to call a great white hope. Jack London had hoped that great white hope would be Jim Jeffries, the storied white fighter from the beginning of our story, now tending an alfalfa farm, whatever the hell that means. But Jeffries refused the call to action. The media continued to berate Johnson and challenge the legacy he was building. But what could a pragmatic racist do? Confront the man with cruelty? Johnson's highly publicized capacity for meticulous and calculated violence all but ensured that the most cruelty a racist would dare direct at Johnson was a shout or a written word. Thus, substantively, Johnson was invincible. In no time, he was rich enough to reject the lifestyle espoused by black intellectuals of that era who would urge the most capable and successful to live below their means and excel in accordance with the rules of the status quo. Johnson, now an icon, lived like a rich white man, committing what was at the time, even among black Americans, considered to be a cardinal sin. Jack Johnson began dating white women, cementing him as a megavillain in the minds of racist whites of the day. You can't punch your way into being white, they probably thought. Once again, I think this was met with such vitriol because whether Johnson concerned himself with this or not, and he almost certainly didn't, it still represented progress for all involved. Show the white men ruling the world that a black son of slaves has now been awarded by their system the means to compel others to challenge that control, at least to some degree. And there's a lot to be said here about intersectionality and what little this does for those at the time who are both not male and not white. But this was still, I think, an intimidating challenge to the status quo. Anyways, young white women ran to the beautiful young fighter, his flashy clothes, his expensive cars, his seemingly pristine, unbroken nose. That's the craziest part to me, is that even on the Wikipedia page, like the first picture you see of Jack Johnson is awful, but pan down to the second, and here's a pristine, statuesque face. Perfect symmetry in the pages of a boxing roster, an ocean of noses that look like Cubics paintings. To put a stop to him, his oppressors would have to rely on the one thing that could truly govern the unencumbered champion: the rules of the ring. Jim Jeffries wasn't coming to their aid, so a runner-up Great White Hope would have to do. In 1909, 3 stepped to the plate. The first 2, Tony Ross and Al Kaufman, were beaten in exhibition matches. Now, typically, these won't affect a fighter's rank, and they won't offer prize money, so the fights aren't usually as bloody. This was fitting. At this point, a symbolic victory was all that white audiences cared about. What's great to me in this moment is that white bystanders are seeking a symbolic victory, proof that they are among the superior, and Jack Johnson is just playing the game. It's almost more cathartic that this is so lopsided. White audiences are going, we have to defend the sanctity and superiority of the master race, and Jack Johnson is like, man, I'm good. The third fight was against an old friend of Johnson's named Stanley Ketchel. This match was thought to bear the same unwritten exhibition match constraints. Have fun, make it look pretty, put on a good show. But in round 12, Ketchel sent a fist into Johnson's temple, which knocked him down and made him mad. Though Johnson had misunderstood the rules up to this point, they were now clear. He stood up and directed an uppercut into Ketchel's chin with such brutal strength that in the grainy footage after the resulting knockout, you can see Johnson picking Stanley's front teeth out of the holes they made when they broke off into his boxing glove. 1909 came to a close, and Jim Jeffries, now 100 pounds overweight, realized that indeed it was him. His destiny was inescapable. He was the Great White Hope. He announced to the world that he was coming out of retirement for the sole purpose of defending the superiority of the white man. Regardless of the outcome of such a fight or for whom you were rooting, the cinema of these circumstances is undeniable. The prize for the fight? The modern equivalent of $3.5 million. 75% to the winner, 25% to the loser, and in addition, a 33% share in film rights for each fighter. The location? Reno, Nevada on the 4th of July, baby. It was dubbed the fight of the century, and once again the media collapsed into a circus of racism. Jack Johnson relished the spotlight and was happy to play the villain to those who saw him as such. Jim Jeffries got to work off-screen and out of the papers, undoubtedly bestowing sacred meaning to his training and the mission of his work. The man spent decades getting punched in the face. Subtlety was knocked out of that skull of his a long time ago. On the day of the fight, Johnson was quoted as saying, "May the best man win." Jeffries stated his mission in plain English. "It is my intention to go right after my opponent and knock him out as soon as possible." As far as fights go, this one, like the Burns-Johnson fight, sucked. Jim Jeffries, a stand-in for white greatness, got into the ring as a mouse does when you lower it into a box with a hungry snake. By the 4th round, it was clear once again, White Hope was in for a humiliating reality check. Jeffries owed his entire career not to nature and God-given talent, but to the bureaucratic and cowardly status quo. The greatest fighter ever known could barely land a single blow on Johnson, who knocked him down for the first time in his career in the 4th round. He would be knocked down for the second time in his career shortly thereafter, and a picture would be taken of Jeffries at some point wherein he resembled an old man fleeing a war zone, clinging desperately to Johnson. By round 14, once again before an audience in stunned silence, match authorities had to intervene to prevent a clean knockout for the bloodied and pathetic Great White Hope. It would have been the first and only knockout in Jeffries' career. To white audiences, Jack Johnson's form was brutally by the book. No funny stuff, no cheap hits, just superior athleticism took gold that day. In claiming the undisputed title, it seemed that Johnson had also beaten a valuable lesson into Jeffries, who shooed away a budding narrative that he lost because he was past his prime, saying, "I could never have whipped Johnson at my best. I couldn't have hit him. No, I couldn't have reached him in 1,000 years." Alas, the glimmer of sportsmanship one could feel in Jeffries' words did not extend to his fans. Following the loss, whites all over 50 U.S. cities rioted, throwing a temper tantrum that claimed 20 lives. A lot of our sources for this one claim that there was rioting on both sides, which is an exhausting and consistent and easily disproved narrative. Blacks celebrated undeniable proof of God-given equality, and the only violence in those circles was inflicted upon them by police, while white rioters demonstrated their capacity for cruelty and violence on the black Americans in their midst. This lopsidedness can be proven easily by the racial disparity in the casualties following the event. Almost everyone who died was black. Johnson spent the remainder of his career fighting only white opponents. He was an athlete, not a freedom fighter, remember, and there was always more money in fighting a white opponent. Though cathartic, I'm sure, the decision to fight only white opponents had considerable implications. Many saw this as a ladder pull, which it kinda was. The Black Heavyweight Championship, though an unofficial title, was hotly contested. Tremendous talents rose and fell in pursuit of its glory, but Johnson wouldn't fight any of them. For Johnson, a loss against one of those fighters meant surrendering the greatest revenue stream known to a black fighter ever at that time. Thus, after Johnson finally lost a championship fight in 1915, a shot at the official heavyweight title would remain out of reach for black contestants until Joe Louis clinched it 22 years later. It's a fascinating story as well, Joe Louis's, but we can't become a boxing podcast. Hope this was a fun listen. I know it's a departure from our typical programming, but it was fun to write. If you feel like we earned it, please like, comment, and subscribe. It makes a giant difference for us. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and goodbye.